Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating linguistic mystery, one that literally flipped everything we thought we knew about language learning completely upside down. Have you ever spent years passively absorbing a language, maybe on an app or watching movies, only to have your mind just go completely blank when you try to order a coffee? Yeah, you are absolutely not alone. We're going to unpack the exact mechanisms of why that happens.
So, here's the big question. Is listening to a language really enough to speak it fluently? Now, what's really interesting about this question is that it hits right at that deep frustration so many of us feel. We understand a foreign language perfectly, we hear the words, we get the gist, right? But we just struggle to actually speak it. For the longest time, linguistic theory told us that listening should be enough. But, as we're going to see, the reality of how the human brain learns a language is way more demanding.
To really get a handle on this, let's contrast two foundational theories. On one side, we have Stephen Krashen's famous 1977 input hypothesis. Krashen basically claimed that comprehensible input is the whole shebang. If you understand the message being spoken to you, your brain just subconsciously acquires the language. Easy, right? But then, on the other side, we have applied linguist Merrill Swain and her output hypothesis. Swain argued that actually input alone leaves some massive, critical gaps. Just because you understand a message doesn't mean you own the grammar required to produce it yourself.
This exact problem was brilliantly spotted by Swain back in the 1970s. She was observing Canadian French immersion programs, often called the Elgin study. These students were literally bathed in French input for years. They took their classes in French, they heard it all day, every day. According to Krashen's theory, they should have become perfectly fluent. But there was this huge anomaly. The students rarely spoke anything longer than a single clause, and when they did, they spoke with these glaring grammatical inaccuracies that simply never went away, no matter how many years they spent immersed.
So what was going wrong? Well, the crucial point Swain identified comes down to how our brains process information. When you simply consume a language, like when you're just listening or reading, your brain engages in what's called semantic processing. You're guessing the meaning through context, vocabulary, real-world clues. You don't actually need to understand the underlying grammar to get the gist. But being pushed to produce language, to actually speak or write, forces your brain to shift gears into syntactic processing. Suddenly, you literally have to figure out how the words fit together structurally. Swain actually broke this whole output mechanism down into three core functions. First up is the noticing function. When you try to speak, you suddenly notice the glaring gap between what you want to say and what you can actually say. Second is the hypothesis testing function. Basically, your spoken output is a guess. It's a test of a language rule you think you know. And third, the metalinguistic function, which is using language to actively reflect on the language itself.
Okay, let's look at a real-world application to see how this actually plays out. There's this incredibly fascinating diary study published in the TSL Canada Journal back in 1990 by a self-directed language learner named Yu Leming. Now, Leming was a highly advanced English learner from China who had moved to Canada. Despite translating novels and passing all these rigorous exams, he found himself really struggling with day-to-day communication. So he kept this meticulous journal of his daily language failures and successes to try and figure out why his passive input just wasn't translating to active output.
Leming's diary provides some incredibly relatable and honestly pretty frustrating anecdotes. Picture this. He's on a Canadian bus, trying to break a $5 bill. He asks a passenger to exchange it, and the passenger just stares at him, completely unhelpful. It was a total communication breakdown. Later, Leming realized he should have just used the word change. This simple pragmatic failure was a light bulb moment. It showed him that all his years of passive academic input hadn't prepared him for the actual, real-world rules of producing language.
He also ran into some pretty severe social communication breakdowns. In one excruciatingly awkward interaction, he ran into a professor who was usually dressed casually, but today was wearing a suit. Wanting to be super polite, Leming said, "You are looking much better today," and then nervously tacked on, "Your face is glowing with radiance." Ouch. In his native culture, that might have been a wonderfully polite compliment, but in Canada, completely inappropriate for a student to comment on a superior's glowing face like that. The sheer awkwardness proved to Leming that mere exposure to English didn't automatically grant him social competence. He literally had to make the mistake out loud to learn from it.
These awkward moments bring us to a really vital concept in language learning called negative input. Researcher Jacqueline Schachter describes this as a universal condition where native speakers provide feedback, whether explicit or implicit, that your language is somehow incorrect or inappropriate.
But here is the catch. Native speakers generally don't want to be rude, so they often just smile and nod if they get the gist of what you're saying, which means learners are absolutely starved for this crucial negative input. We actually see Swain's hypothesis testing in action when learners actively hunt for that negative input. For example, Ling Meng tells his office mate Elizabeth that someone's jobs are, quote, full. He watches her carefully. She doesn't correct him out loud, but she gives this brief, puzzled look. Because Ling Meng is actively monitoring his output, he catches that visual cue. He spots the negative input. He immediately recognizes his error, pauses the conversation, asks for the right phrasing, and learns the correct target phrase, jobs are taken. He had to speak to generate that correction.
And this brings us right to the logical counterpart of Swain's theory, something famously noted in Leeming's study: incomprehensible output. This happens when a learner's spoken message just fails to hit the mark of precision and coherence. It's not the listener's fault, right? It's due to the speaker's own grammatical gaps. Eliminating this incomprehensible output becomes the true engine of language acquisition.
Leeming perfectly captures this struggle when he was trying to figure out how to say install a telephone. Let's trace his steps. It's almost like a giant puzzle. First, relying on a direct translation from Chinese, he told a mechanic to fix a telephone. Total breakdown in communication. Next, he tried establish a telephone. The message was received this time, but it sounded grammatically weird. Finally, by analyzing the feedback he was getting, he landed on the correct syntactic target, install. He had to push through the wrong output to finally find the right one.
Okay, so let's pause and look at why this absolutely matters for you. Leeming's ultimate takeaway is that your own output acts as a mechanism that forces you to critically analyze the structure of the language. When you finally speak, you suddenly realize what you don't know. And this is a total game changer because it makes any future input you hear far more comprehensible. Why? Because now your brain is actively listening for the grammar it knows it's missing, rather than just passively guessing at the meaning.
However, to impartially understand this whole field, we can't just look at the successes. We've got to look at the academic critiques too. So let's examine a 2020 paper by researchers Hilal Pakar and Zeynep Arslan, where they reevaluated Swain's output hypothesis.
Pakar and Arslan highlight three major issues that educators and learners really need to be aware of. First off, they note that Swain's hypothesis lacks a strict operational definition for what comprehensible output actually is in a measurable way. Second, in real-world classrooms, there's a severe scarcity of opportunities for students to actually produce output. Let's face it, teachers do most of the talking. But the third point is absolutely critical. The theory ignores the very real, sometimes intense anxiety that learners experience when they are forced to speak before they're fully ready. Pushing a learner to output can sometimes paralyze them with fear, which obviously does way more harm than good.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we are left with a pretty provocative question. If Krashen was wrong and input alone isn't enough, but Swain's required output can cause debilitating anxiety, what is the perfect balance for the future of language learning? How do we build systems that bridge the gap between comfortable, passive listening and the demanding, highly vulnerable active speaking? It's a tricky balance every language learner has to strike for themselves. Think about that the next time you dive into learning a new language. Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning how you learn.